In this topic, we're going to discuss the adaptations of plants to different environments. So just to start off the topic, here you can see a beautiful flame lily. That is the national flower of Zimbabwe. So we're going to look at mesophytes, xerophytes, and hydrophytes. So mesophytes are plants that grow in areas with enough water. Xerophytes are plants that grow in areas with very little water, for example, deserts. And hydrophytes are plants that grow in areas which are mostly water, for example, ponds. Now, when you're asked to explain an adaptation to the environment, always state the adaptation first, for example, air spaces in hydrophytes, and then explain how it is useful. Okay, let's have a look at mesophytes first. So mesophytes are plants that grow in areas with enough water. So example would be garden plants. Now garden plants are grown for their colourful scented flowers and because they look attractive. They also provide shade. So mesophytes are terrestrial, which means land plants, which are adapted to neither particularly dry nor particularly wet environment. And they usually have enough water and do not have such extreme adaptations that are needed, for example, desert plants. So many garden plants are mesophytes because gardeners can provide them with enough water. Okay, moving on to xerophytes. So xerophytes are plants that grow in areas with very little water, for example, deserts. Now, all plants have to balance water uptake with water loss. So it's important that they maintain the turgor in their cells or they will wilt. And if a plant transpires too much, it could kill the plant if the plant cannot absorb enough water to prevent long-term wilting. So xerophytes are plants that are able to exist in conditions where water is scarce. This means that they are adapted to xeric, which means dry, environments. For example, a desert or areas in Africa that only have seasonal rainfall. So they're adapted to store water, reduce water loss, and take up more water from the soil. Have a look at this cactus. How is a cactus adapted to a dry environment? Well, cacti can reduce water loss and conserve water in the following ways. Their leaves are reduced to spines, so this reduces the surface area of the leaf over which water can be lost. They've got a thick, waxy cuticle which covers the plant's surfaces and reduces transpiration. Their swollen stems are water storage areas, so they contain water storage tissues. They've got shallow, spreading root systems to absorb water quickly if there's any rainfall or overnight condensation. Now, many cacti have got a round, compact shape. What do you think this does? This reduces the surface area, so there's less surface through which water can be lost. They also have shiny surfaces which reflect heat and light. And their stomata are closed during the day to reduce water loss. They may open their stomata at night to absorb the carbon dioxide, which they store for use in photosynthesis during the day. Photosynthesis also occurs in the outer layers of the cells in their stems. So how can plants store water? Well, they can have succulent leaves, a succulent stem, or a fleshy tuber. So have a look at these plants here. You can see that they are fleshy because they've stored water. Notice the stems are also used for storing water. Many of the indigenous plants we see in Africa are in the euphorbia family. So they've got succulent stems to store water and small spiny leaves, so there's less water loss. The stems are green so that they can photosynthesize. Many bromeliads and other plants are able to store water in what we call a tank, which is formed by the tightly overlapping leaf bases. So there are many adaptations of leaves to limit water loss through the stomata. We've looked at a few adaptations of cacti. Can you think of how leaves can be adapted to reduce water loss? Well, they've got a waxy cuticle, so this prevents evaporation of water from the upper epidermis. Few stomata, so the stomata open to let in carbon dioxide. And remember, water loss is a consequence of that. So fewer stomata means less water loss, but it does limit the rate of carbon dioxide uptake. The stomata are sunken, so these are found in what we call pits, in which a humid environment forms, so there's not much of a diffusion gradient. Hairs on the surface, these stop the diffusion shells from being blown away from around the stomata, making the air outside the stomata quite humid. And curled leaves. These also create a humid microenvironment around the stomata, so the leaves curl to protect the stomata on the underside. So here you can see these leaves have a very thick cuticle, preventing evaporation from the epidermis. Okay, you can't really see it, but these leaves do have a thick cuticle. This picture's of marram grass. Have a look how the leaf has curled in on itself, and it's got epidermal hairs, a thick waxy cuticle, and the stomata are sunken, so you find them in pits. So have a look at this leaf section. What's happened is the leaf has curled in on itself. Can you identify the adaptations to a dry environment? So some plants have reduced leaves, for example acacia trees, and these small leaves have a reduced surface area through which water can be lost. So many plants in Africa have very small leaves for this reason. During the dry months, we also see very few trees with leaves on them. The trees are not dead, but they're dormant. For example, the baobab in this picture. So no photosynthesis takes place, but the plants can remove chlorophyll from the leaves for storage before allowing the leaves to fall. So when this rain starts again, the plant or the tree will grow new leaves and become productive again. Some plants grow during the rainy season, then die off and are dormant or exist as seeds in the dry season. So grasses are a good example. The dead grass burns easily, so bushfires are particularly common in the dry months in Zimbabwe. Plants in dry environments also have ways of taking in water, for example, a deep root system. So with long tap roots that go deep into the ground, and most acacias have got long tap roots, absorbing surface moisture from the surface of the leaf. Now these interesting plants are actually trees found in the desert in Namibia. They absorb fog through their stomata, which remain open at night if moisture is present. Okay, lastly, let's look at hydrophytes. So these are plants that grow in areas which are mostly water, for example, ponds. So these are plants that live in an aquatic environment. Floating plants save energy as they don't need to transport water. They have little or no xylem tissue. The roots are for anchorage. there are no root hairs. The leaves have little or no cuticle since there's no need to conserve water. And they've also got large air spaces in between the mesophyll cells. So this is for buoyancy and gas storage. And the stomata are on the upper surface of the leaf. So the stomata allow carbon dioxide uptake from the atmosphere. Now the problem for hydrophytes is that carbon dioxide, which is needed for photosynthesis, diffuses through water much more slowly than it does through air. The same applies for oxygen, needed for plant respiration, since it's not very soluble in water. Therefore, many hydrophytes have an extensive system of air spaces in their stems and leaves through which gases diffuse quickly. These air spaces provide buoyancy to keep the plants close to the light, and they're also a reservoir of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So here you can see a cross-section through the leaf. Notice the large air spaces in the leaf that allow for gases to be stored and to keep the plant buoyant. This plant's also got stomata at the top of the plant. Top of the leaf. So here you can see the stomata at the top of the leaf. So in this topic we looked at mesophytes, which are plants that grow in areas with enough water, xerophytes, which are plants that grow in areas with very little water, for example deserts. So can you list how the leaves are adapted to a dry environment and how the plant is adapted to a dry environment? And then hydrophytes, which are plants that grow in areas or aquatic areas. So you need to know about the features of each of these and how they are adapted to the environment. And that concludes our lesson, the end.